The most important decision we make is whether we believe we live in a friendly or hostile universe. For if we decide that the universe is an unfriendly place, then we will use our technology, our scientific discoveries, and our natural resources to achieve safety and power by creating bigger walls to keep out the unfriendliness, and bigger weapons to destroy all that is unfriendly. And I believe that we are getting to a place where technology is powerful enough that we may either completely isolate or destroy ourselves as well in this process. If we decide that the universe is neither friendly nor unfriendly, and that God is essentially playing dice with the universe, then we are simply victims to the random toss of the dice and our lives have no real purpose or meaning. But if we decide that the universe is a friendly place, then we will use our technology, our scientific discoveries, and our natural resources to create tools and models for understanding that universe. Because power and safety will come through understanding its workings and its motives. Albert Einstein. Hi all. This is an intense video on an intense topic which I believe is affecting us all on a very deep level. I've tried to divide it into chapters which will help make this thought flow make meaningful sense. We are facing an incredible period in human history. The shift of culture worldwide is either a cause of grief for many or an opportunity and potential for some. It seems, however, that the collective is gripped by a very deeply embedded subconscious death wish. On the one hand, it seems that we can't accept our own death. No one believes in his own death. In the unconscious, everyone is convinced of their own immortality. There is no sense of the passage of time. Time does not work chronologically in our unconscious. The true nature of heroism may lie in this unconscious belief in immortality, that nothing will happen to us anyhow. On the other hand, we seem to be self-sabotaging every step of the way and racing to our own demise. When researching the possibility of a collective death wish, I quickly realized that I wasn't the only one observing this phenomenon. Freud wrote about an underlying death wish in all people, which he called Todestrieb, and the possibility is likely there may be a collective death wish as well. Before we dive in, please note that the concepts of each presented thinker and philosopher have been abbreviated for the purpose of this video. Each one has contributed greatly to humanity, and the purpose of pulling out several catchy concepts of theirs is to track a pervasive line of thinking and what has been done with their thoughts over time. It does not mean that any of these people mentioned or quoted would have endorsed what has been made out of their concepts, musings, and ruminations. We are observing the path some have taken and what they have done with these ideas, and I'm pretty sure some of the original thinkers would be turning in their graves. On the website of the Canadian Association of Club of Rome, a branch of that infamous Club of Rome, a society promoting depopulation and one-child policy to curb environmental and economic concerns, and also known for its book, The Limits to Growth, published in 1972, I found an article posing the same questions but coming to very different conclusions than I. But the opening questions and observations remain. In this article, the thought flow was as follows. When people are overwhelmed with life, they contemplate suicide. When society comprised of humans is overwhelmed with life, what does it do? How far do fear and denial of death factor into our collective despair and sense of futility of life? Does society have a Freudian death wish? The author goes on to say that we are committing two suicides, ecological and cultural, where we stop believing in ourselves. The death drive is the drive towards death, destruction, and forgetfulness. It was first proposed by Sigmund Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. The death drive opposes eros, the tendency towards survival, propagation, hunger, thirst, sex, and other creative life-producing drives. One of the tendencies of the death drive is the repetition of trauma. I have to add that when it comes to trauma, I see trauma as the soul's inability to find love in the situation experienced after having worked through with so many people and also done my own work. This is the one common thread I found, was that usually when it's a negative, deep trauma, there was this inability to find love in the situation. Once that love is seen and really believed, then healing can start to happen. But that's a whole other topic and video. So back to his points. He continues to discuss whether we have lost faith in institutions, religions, social conventions, and norms. And then there is also the question, are we so filled with self-loathing and disconnected from our own souls and each other that we have a Freudian death wish? We deny that we make decisions out of fear and isolation. And the result is that we no longer believe in ourselves and our values and are unable to change. On the one hand, we act frozen in our beliefs that we will never die. We believe that cultures don't change, are static, and after a blip, we can just return to the good old days. And for example, now there is a call for amnesty for what was done and said during the pandemic. On the other side of this one point, it also seems that we simultaneously crave and yet despise the past from which we come from. The author writes, denial path number 1 has us continue to worship the god of exponential growth and his representative on earth, the GDP. The results of worshiping this false god are obvious: environmental annihilation. In spite of the fact that the damage from this false god are now clear for all to see, our inability to stop worshiping him means we are incapable of change, and once again, we are frozen. Even those who see the destruction do not have the willpower to make the hard choices that are needed, choices like conscious decreases in population and consumption and travel. Not changing is suicide. This form of denial seems to me like a right-wing form of suicide. Denial path number 2, he says, is the opposite problem. We have no more God of growth. We are not for anything. We are against everything. We find what is wrong without finding out what is right. We are idealists, but not practical. This denial is the road to hell paved with good intentions. Support for this form of cultural suicide is promoted by the likes, he says, of Jordan Peterson, formerly of University of Toronto, in his recent speech entitled "The Collapse of Our Values is a Greater Threat Than Climate Change," and also in the short essay by Victor Hansen from a rather right-wing American website. This form of denial seems like a left-wing form of suicide. The author continues to think about the imbalance our drive for absolute power brings, rather than a balance of power, and what we, in his opinion, need to do to counteract. Contrary to his view, we seem to actually be moving into a population decline, not an overpopulation as has been worried about, and we will see in this video where that worry possibly originated and the line of thinking it has spawned. Our birth decline may come from a combination of factors such as nature, but also from the societies we must live under and the changing values. Increased security, for example, surely also plays a role, as children are no longer seen as old age insurance. But that topic is a completely different video. There seem to be forces which exist, which keep us focused on and destined to arrive at, and then trapped in a nihilistic, cynical denial of death, unappreciative of life worldview. A series posted on Strategic Culture Foundation website, which was written by Matthew Arrett, caught my eye, and I lean on it in the following as it brings us back to the very beginning. We have to understand a certain flow of consciousness or stream of thinking and where that originated from, which seemingly affects many in power today. And while doing that, there are 3 points to consider when looking at these forces of influence. Number 1 is the authorities, scientists, researchers, authors, philosophers, thinkers, which purport to know everything there is to know and elevate as figures of authority, planting seeds in the collective subconscious, also in a desire to egotistically maybe leave a legacy. Then number 2 is the 2 different paradigms. One sees the creator as the beginning and the end, the other paradigm doesn't see a creator at all, and the spiritual seeking of human nature is simply an expression of infantility. Concepts such as spirit, soul, intention have no value here. And the third point is that our modern society is heavily based, via education, on the thought concepts of Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher who, amongst other things, stated that since his particular society embraced slavery, it was obvious that slavery was built into the fabric of the universe itself. Aristotelian teachings were also the foundation of our current understanding of what a gentleman is, for example, and how he should behave. The ideas have become deeply ingrained in our cultures. Although the word gentleman has Anglo roots, the ideas the Anglos based their concept on was derived from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is his best-known work on ethics with the aim of political science and the master art of politics. It consists of 10 books, understood to be based on notes of his lectures. The Nicomachean Ethics had an influence on European Middle Ages and therefore bore great weight in the development of all modern philosophy, Western law, and theology. These concepts became important to what a gentleman or a man is in Western understanding of the term, and subsequently most likely flowed into self-identification and the basis of thinking in men in general, also men, of course, in political power. In the 17th century, Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes argued that the medieval and Renaissance tradition of Aristotelian practical thinking had become a great impediment to philosophy. However, it prevailed. Although Aristotle, for the most part, was all about the elevation of the human being and the development of virtues, he also wrote on slavery, which is arguably a practical, simple observation. And I quote, "Is there anyone thus intended by nature to be a slave, and for whom such a condition is expedient and right? Or rather, is not all slavery a violation of nature?" There is no difficulty in answering this question, on grounds both of reason and of fact. For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. He goes on to say that there are many different divergent definitions of justice and virtue, and they cannot be seen in the same context for subject and master. In contrast, the elder Plato strove for unifying principles behind all definitions, but Aristotle throughout his writings leads us to contemplate that no soul with any immortal character may exist, since we are all nothing but blank slates to be written on by material experiences. Aristotle theorizes that the universe itself is number 1 static, number 2 eternal, number 3 uncreative. He wrote about unmoved movers, whom he said were perfect beings with no influence over material creation, distant and impotent. Aristotelian logic via Boole and his laws of thought can arguably be seen as the foundation of all computer coding. In Aristotle's sequence of logic, lifeless rocks were more perfect than constantly changing and unpredictable organisms of the biosphere, such as humans. Our constant changes could only mean we are furthest removed from those divine, unmoved movers. If only we could be reprogrammed to be just like them, unmoving, unchanging, obedient, and good. John Locke is credited with having inspired the writers of the American Declaration of Independence, seen in the writings of John Adams and George Washington, and also in writings by Thomas Jefferson. It seems Locke also inspired other things besides life, liberty, and property. John Locke's concepts in his 1689 essay on human understanding underline the humans as a blank slate concept of Aristotle. It also seems he absorbed Aristotle's views on slavery and that it was an immutable part of the universe. His beliefs that slaves could be regarded as mere property can be seen in his draft of the Constitution for Carolina, and possibly to him justified his vast shares in the British Royal Africa Company. The British Royal Africa Company brought millions of slaves from Africa to the British colonies during his lifetime. Reading the Constitution for the Carolinas, which he wrote, one can see hereditary power being systemized and slaves being referred to as leetmen. Any lord of a manor may alienate, sell, or dispose to any other person and his heirs forever his manor, all entirely together, with all the privileges and leetmen thereunto belonging. In every signory, barony, and manor, all the leetmen shall be under the jurisdiction of the respective lords of the said signory, barony, or manor, without appeal from him. Nor shall any leetman or leetwoman have liberty to go off from the land of their particular lord and live anywhere else without license from their said lord under hand and seal. All the children of Leetmen shall be Leetmen, and so to all generations. That's hard for me to read and requote and say. Every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of what opinion or religion soever. The energies surrounding these ideas which have been given life still need to be cleared, as energetically we're still carrying some of this and other forms of oppression forward. These ideas regarding mastery and slavery have bled into American and into international society and arguably underlie the fabric of thought lining modern work and corporate culture, influencing the fabric of societal thoughts and structures. These moral roots are some of the underlying values which have evolved into our values today. An opponent to Locke's version of things was Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz was a German polymath, an eternal optimist, and one of the foremost rationalist and idealistic thinkers. He was, amongst many, many other things, also advisor to Tsar Peter the Great, Emperor Charles VI, Duke Anton Ulrich, Empress Sophie von Hanover. He was founder of the Academies of Science in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. He was the first Western thinker to popularize Confucian thought in the West. He took inspiration from the notation in the I Ching and invented binary language, which served as the basis for modern computers, and wrote an extraordinary amount of journals, letters, and manuscripts on an array of topics, fluently in 6 languages, published and unpublished. He believed that this was the best universe God could create. He wrote the New Essay on Human Understanding in 1704. Our differences are on subjects of some importance, he says. The question is to know whether the soul in itself is entirely empty, like the tablet on which nothing has yet been written, tabula rasa, according to Aristotle and the author of the essay, Locke, and whether all that is traced thereon comes solely from the senses and from experience, or whether the soul contains originally the principles of several notions and doctrines which external objects merely awaken on occasions, as I believe with Plato and even with the schoolmen and with all those who take with this meaning the passage of St. Paul, where he remarks that the law of God is written in the heart. Gottfried also had an ongoing thought dispute with another famous thinker, Sir Isaac Newton, who had many skeletons in his closet, not the least the persistent rumors he seemingly gifted his young niece Catherine Barton to Charles Montague, Lord Halifax, and subsequently boosted his career. As to his career, there seemed to be a few inconsistencies, unclarities, cover-up lies, and distorted truths. In his last year of life, Leibniz took an aim at another Newtonian concept, one which led to the presumption of the universe winding down like a mechanical clock. And this presumption, this Newtonian concept, would be the first expression of what would later develop into the concept of entropy. In short, these thinkers believed, maybe they didn't realize they seemed to, that we lived in a dying universe with an impotent creator without any wisdom. The implicit image of the creator was that the universe was created with an embarrassing design flaw, and one which any mere human could detect. In contrast to this belief, Leibniz wrote, I'm not saying that the material world is a machine, a watch, say, that runs without God's intervening, and I have pretty strongly insisted that the things he has created need his continual influence. But I do say that the material world is a watch that runs without needing to be mended by God, otherwise we would have to say that God changes his mind. In fact, God has foreseen everything, and for anything that might go wrong, he has provided a remedy in advance. There is in his works a harmony, a pre-established beauty. This opinion does not exclude God's providence or his government of the world. On the contrary, it makes it perfect. A true divine providence requires perfect foresight. Sadly, upon his death, Newtonianism prevailed throughout much of Western academia and science. The most destructive outcome of Newtonian thought was the enslavement of the mind to sense perception, or empiricism, and the denial of hypothesis formation. This leaves only cold logic, without any creativity, a mirror of the belief that the universe was a material, sense-only, dying universe without a creative principle, which limits the mind in a similar fashion as the victims in Plato's cave. In The World That Doesn't Work That Way Anymore, an essay written by Alistair Crooke, he writes, Quote, "The liberal order rests on three pillars, on three interlocking co-constituting pillars. Newton's laws were projected to lend the Anglo-economic model its claim to being founded in hard empirical laws, as if it were physics. Rousseau, Locke, and their followers elevated individualism as a political principle, and from Smith came the logic core to the Anglo-American system. If each individual does what is best for him or her, the result will be what is best for the nation as a whole." So this shows the drive for individualism, which is so heavy, let's say, in North American society. Other societies, it's more about the collective, but here we see the logic core to the system, right? Throughout the 19th century, in spite of all the inspirations and incredible findings and developments which blew our narrow confines of thought and our understanding of the world, there was a faction of thinkers which continued to believe in and promote the belief in an uncreative universe bound by absolute limits. As population levels grew, the thought arose that God had so inaccurately created humanity that elites were needed to cull useless eaters from time to time. The Anglican Reverend Thomas Malthus was most explicit in his view. Writing in his first edition of the 1799 essay on the principle of population, Malthus says, quote, "We should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague." A little later, Malthus even argued for the early extermination of poor babies who are of low values to society when he said, quote, "I should propose a regulation to be made, declaring that no child born from any marriage taking place after the expiration of a year from the date of the law, and no illegitimate child born 2 years from the same date, should ever be entitled to parish assistance. The infant is, comparatively speaking, of little value to society, as others will immediately supply its place." Wow, it is so hard for me to, and these thoughts people have actually picked up and they've run with it. And even if these thoughts were just said in moments of, absolute frustration, which can occur, somebody out there 100 years later took it seriously and ran with it. So Henry Carey, who became a leading advisor to Abraham Lincoln, recognized that limits to population growth potential could always be changed by encouraging advanced rates of progress, which is also what we have seen happen today. Birth rate is in decline in most economically advanced nations. In his Unity of Law, as exhibited in the Relations of Physical, Social, Mental, and Moral Science from 1872, he writes, quote, "Mr. Malthus was led to invent a law of population by means of which to relieve the rich and powerful from all responsibility for the existing state of things, giving them assurance that the poverty and wretchedness by which they were everywhere surrounded had resulted from the fact that the Creator had sent upon the earth large numbers of people for whom he had provided no table at which they might be allowed to eat, no materials by aid of which they might be clothed, thus furnishing the theory by aid of which subsequent writers have been enabled, as they suppose, to prove that, in the British Islands, man had become a drug and population a nuisance." French scientist Sadi Carnot revolutionized industrial engineering and design with his advancements in heat-powered steam engines and thermodynamics. Certain mathematicians took Carnot's work as a working model upon which the entire universe and human nature could be described. Carnot observed that any heat-powered machine will always burn more energy than is created over time, and that this heat will always move irreversibly from hot to cold until a state of thermodynamic equilibrium is attained. At this point, the machine operator must add more fuel, or else the system will not return to life. The observed obvious properties of heat-powered machines made by humans, which necessarily tended towards heat death over time, were taken by some, and they extended these properties to the entire universe. It was seen as an additional binding of all space and time. The personality who did the most to popularize the notion that the entire universe, like Newton's clock, was irrevocably designed to wind down into a heat death of total entropy was Rudolf Clausius. In an 1865 treatise which popularized what became the second law of thermodynamics, aka entropy, Clausius wrote of the two constants shaping the dead universe. In his theory, the universe became similar to a heat-powered machine assumed to be a closed system bound in space and time with a limited amount of energy to sustain all moving parts contained within it. Applying this view to the universe in the mid-20th century gave rise to the Big Bang model, which sees our universe originating from 1 point 13.7 billion years ago. Before that, it is thought there was nothing, and all existence has been expanding from that time into an infinite expanse of nothing. Once this expansion has ended, it can then also be assumed that an infinite nothingness will return forever. One particularly notable mathematician who jumped on the nihilistic bandwagon was Lord Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell wrote critical expositions of the philosophy of Leibniz and performed a slash and burn. Sometimes I wonder, personally, if the thought processes and works these people do are simply to elevate themselves and outdo one another, and we end up taking them bitterly seriously to the point we actually build entire worlds on these concepts they simply use to sound smarter than the last. Russell co-wrote with Alfred North Whitehead in 1910 an homage to Sir Newton's Principia, a 3-volume opus called Principia Mathematica, which reduced the entire universe to a limited set of logical points, allowing no space for creative change or a living creator. In 1903, he wrote this depressing statement that, quote, "Man is the product of causes that had no provision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair," I'm despairing reading this quote, you guys, "can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." How depressing and irrational. But if you happen to be an existential nihilist looking for an excuse to avoid using your conscience, then, as Matthew Ehret says, then this may be the perfect one. Following this line of thinking and stream of consciousness brings us to the emergence of cybernetics, a new science of control, which was traced from the mind of Russell to his leading student, Norbert Wiener. He wrote a book called Cybernetics in 1948. Cybernetics was the practical application of Russell's Principia Mathematica, which Wiener had studied. Wiener wrote of his Cambridge experience saying, "My chief teacher and mentor was Bertrand Russell, with whom I studied mathematical logic and a good many more general matters concerning the philosophy of science and mathematics." Ehret writes, "The key to understanding the attraction of cybernetics to a scientific dictatorship desirous of total omniscience and omnipotence is the following. In the context of a large boat, only the helmsman need have an idea of the whole. Everyone else need only understand their local, compartmentalized role. With the application of cybernetics to the organization of economic systems, vast complex bureaucracies emerged with only small nodes of helmsmen embedded within the newly emerging deep state complex who had access to a vision of the whole. This idea was carried forth by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Sir Alexander King, who co-founded the Club of Rome and helped to apply these ideas across governments of the transatlantic community during the 1960s and 70s. This system was viewed by its proponents as the perfect operating system for a supranational technocracy to use to control the levers of the New World Order. I remember, personally, growing up in Germany, one of the major observations Germans seemed to have regarding Americans was their compartmentalized thinking and work style. They seemed to know a lot about their job and small part in the corporate structure, but had no ability or authority to envision the bigger or deeper picture and often seemed reluctant to do so. Germans tended to see this as a disadvantage on many levels. But we'll see how this whole cybernetics thought took over the world when we continue this. One of the most enthusiastic practitioners of this new system was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, father of the current Justin Trudeau. Trudeau Sr. shaped a vast cybernetics revolution of the Canadian government between 1968 through 1972 through Canada's Privy Council office. During a November 1969 conference on cybernetics in government, Trudeau said, "We are aware that the many techniques of cybernetics, by transforming the control function and the manipulation of information, will transform our whole society. With this knowledge, we are wide awake, alert, capable of action. No longer are we blind, inert powers of fate." Here, Trudeau's adoration of cybernetics had been shared by his Russian soulmate Nikita Khrushchev, who rehabilitated the banned bourgeoisie pseudoscience after Stalin had died. In his October 1961 to the 22nd Party Congress, Khrushchev stated, "It is imperative to organize wider application of cybernetics, electronic computing and control installations in production, research work, drafting and designing, planning, accounting, statistics, and management." Trudeau worked closely with Sir Alexander King and Aurelio Pichet, I hope I pronounced that right, founding their new organization, the Club of Rome. This club has had a profound impact on global governance from 1968 to the present. Trudeau even presided over the Canadian branch of the Club of Rome and allocated money to fund the MIT Club of Rome study, Limits to Growth. Alexander King used the computer model made famous in the 1972 Limits to Growth to justify the concept of depopulation, in other words, the culling of the unfit and overpopulated useless eaters. This idea was subsequently incorporated into the third official World Economic Forum meeting at Davos, where Aurelio Pichet was introduced by Klaus Schwab and showcased the Limits to Growth magic to thousands of supportive attendees. A new schism opened between nature and natural developments, which were completely untrusted, and so-called nurture according to a human's understanding and calculations by its aid, the computer. Ehret continues, "This particular meeting at Davos was sponsored by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, a man who had already distinguished himself amongst upper-level managers of the empire by founding the infamous Bilderberg meetings in 1954 and later the World Wildlife Fund for Nature in 1961 alongside Julian Huxley and Prince Philip Mountbatten. In addition to incorporating Club of Rome population models into cybernetics-based planning, this summit also featured the official unveiling of the Davos Manifesto, a document which formalized the concept of stakeholder capitalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution into the governing manifesto of this Junior Bilderberger annual summit. A prominent conference member and planner of this operation from its earliest days during World War II was named Sir Julian Huxley. Huxley was a leading eugenicist and imperial grand strategist who worked closely with fellow Fabian Society leader Bertrand Russell. Huxley shared Russell and Wiener's devout belief in universal entropy, saying in 1953, "Nowhere in all its vast extent is there any trace of purpose or even of prospective significance. It is impelled from behind by blind physical forces, a gigantic jazz dance of particles and radiations in which the only overall tendency we have so far been able to detect is that summarized in the second law of thermodynamics, the tendency to run down." As he was beginning to formulate his concept of transhumanism, and while he was organizing the Macy Cybernetics conferences, Julian also found the time to create the United Nations Education, Science and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in 1946, drafting its founding manifesto. His entropic view of biology and physics was clearly expressed in this bone-chilling political views, wherein he writes, "The moral for UNESCO is clear. The task laid upon it of promoting peace and security can never be wholly realized through the means assigned to it, education, science, and culture. It must envisage some form of world political unity, whether through a single world government or otherwise, as the only certain means of avoiding war. In its educational program, it can stress the ultimate need for a world political unity and familiarize all peoples with the implications of the transfer of full sovereignty from separate nations to a world organization." Cybernetics conferences evolved throughout the 1960s, 1970s, increasingly integrated with international organizations like the United Nations, World Health Organization, NATO, and OECD. As this integration occurred, the new technocrats became ever more influential in setting the standards of the New World operating system. Meanwhile, national governments found themselves increasingly cleansed of nationalist moral leaders like John F. Kennedy, Charles de Gaulle, Enrico Mattei, and John Diefenbacher. It was Julian Huxley who coined the term transhumanism in 1957. Around this time, the cult of artificial intelligence, guided by a belief in the inevitable merger of man and machine, grew increasingly, with such major events as the man-computer symbiosis thesis of J.C.R. Licklider in 1960 and the application of these systems into Department of Defense programs like War Games Command Systems, SAGE, or Semi-Automatic Ground Environment and Unmanned Jet Plane Defense Networks. DARPA's augmented cognition computer soldier dyads were yet another expression of this perverse idea, with hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the creation of enhanced cyborg soldiers. Over the years, followers of this new cult soon found themselves operating as helmsmen in the new global ship of Earth, giving rise to a new global elite class of technocrats and oligarchs who are loyal only to their caste and ideology. They strive to shape their minds ever more closely to the model idea: computing machines are capable of logic but not love or creativity. The more that these cultish technocrats could think like cold computers while getting the masses of the earth to do the same, the more their thesis that computers must obviously replace human thought could be maintained. Quote by Ehret: "The moral of this story, whether we review," Ehret says, "the growth of eugenics as a new pseudoscience of population control, or in the growth of cybernetics, or even when we review the growth of modern ecologism and transhumanism out of cybernetics, the seeds of Aristotle's oligarchical cosmology can be felt viscerally. The continuity of this dark cosmology through the centuries as it flowed into the works of Locke, Newton, Malthus, Clausius, Galton, Russell, and Wiener are not coincidental but direct, causal, and substantive. It is only when we finally learn to see the thing called Western philosophy and Western science as not one but two opposing paradigms that we will begin to properly think about which current we wish to situate our lives within and devote ourselves to defending." And that's absolutely right, because, if you break it down, this foundational concept is what gives rise to AI and to our technology nowadays. But technology would have evolved anyways, but would it have had a more humane, a different basis, a more creative basis if we had followed different thinkers? The thought is out there. What would have happened if we would follow a different stream of consciousness, right? So that's what we're looking at in this final part. What would have happened if we had a different basis for our technology and systems control, instead of coming from a death-defying point of view, or coming from a point of view that we're living in a dead universe, or that there is no love, there is no creativity, there's only logic? What would have happened? What kind of computing systems would we be working with now? What would they look like? What would they feel like? What would they be like? Eugenics, so en vogue in the 19th century, dressed up in new clothes in the mid-20th century, calling itself now transhumanism. Who were the people that thought this all up? What was their thinking based upon? Were they neglected as children, abused, daddy, mommy, or both issues projected onto an uncaring universe? Or is it all just fighting to maintain recognition and stay in the boys' club? This new science, Ehret says, danced with another bad idea, masquerading as a universal law, in quotes, which was called entropy, and found its champions among an array of social engineers who were committed to a static faith in a dying universe managed by an impotent and irrational God who was made in their own image. The practical application of this entropic science of population control took the form of a system dubbed cybernetics, founded by an apostle of Bertrand Russell named Norbert Wiener, both of whom attempted to appropriate the name of Gottfried Leibniz, founder of calculus, binary language, and computing machines, as a new godhead within their new church. Let's have a look at some suggested scientists who stayed in the light and weren't seduced by the dark Sith lords of entropy and cybernetics. These scientists found ways to retain their faith in a benevolent universe and creator, and brought us all to a new connection and understanding of the living universe. Number 1, Victor Schauberger. One of the leading scientists to follow Leibnizian tradition was an Austrian naturalist named Victor Schauberger. Well known as a genius in Austria, Schauberger was soon brought to meet Adolf Hitler in 1933. Hitler promised Schauberger government support for his research on flying saucer technology that relied upon energy generated by the flow of air and water in specific currents. Overthrowing the popular notion of heat engines, Schauberger recognized that his design required no adherence to entropy or its corollary, the conservation of energy. Schauberger's creative works and discoveries were absorbed into the military-industrial complexes, first of Hitler's Germany and then by the post-war West. However, his faith in a living creative universe was unwavering. The naturalist expressed his understanding by saying, "Nature is not served by rigid laws, but by rhythmical, reciprocal processes. Nature uses none of the preconditions of the chemist or the physicist for the purposes of evolution. Nature excludes all fire on principle for purposes of growth. Therefore, all contemporary machines are unnatural and constructed according to false premises. Nature avails herself of the biodynamic form of motion, through which the biological prerequisite for the emergence of life is provided. Its purpose is to procreate higher conditions of matter out of the originally inferior raw materials which afford the evolutionary older or the numerically greater rising generation the possibility of a constant capacity to evolve, for without any growing and increasing reserves of energy, there would be no evolution or development. This results first and foremost in the collapse of the so-called law of the conservation of energy, and in further consequence the law of gravity and all other dogmatic lose any rational or practical basis." Wow, I'm tripping over these words. Okay, moving on to number 2, which is, quote, Gödel, another genius and Leibniz devotee who entered into combat in defense of creativity and a living God, was, quote, Gödel. He was convinced that something severely destructive had been created with Bertrand Russell's 1913 Principia Mathematica and sought to remedy the poison before it could do more damage to scientific creativity than it already had. In 1931, Gödel published his famous incompleteness theorem, which took Russell's years of work and diminished it. Expressing his understanding that order cannot simultaneously arise without purpose from randomness, Gödel spoke of the creative evolution of life, which must express the same principle of creativity governing the universe when he said, "The formation in geological time of the human body by the laws of physics, starting from a random distribution of elementary particles, is as unlikely as the separation of the atmosphere into its components. The complexity of the living things has to be present within the material from which they are derived or in the laws governing their formation." He also took aim at Alan Turing, positing that the machine thinking would outdo human thinking. And he said, Turing gives an argument which is supposed to show that mental procedures cannot carry any further than mechanical procedures. However, this argument is inconclusive because it depends on the supposition that a finite mind is capable of only a finite number of distinguishable states. What Turing disregards completely is the fact that mind, in its use, is not static but constantly developing. Gödel believed that God was personal and called his philosophy rationalistic, idealistic, optimistic, and theological. Gödel believed in an afterlife, saying, of course, this supposes that there are many relationships which today's science and received wisdom haven't any inkling of. But I'm convinced of this, the afterlife, independently of any theology. It is possible today to perceive by pure reasoning that it is entirely consistent with known facts. If the world is rationally constructed and has meaning, then there must be such a thing as an afterlife. Interesting side note, in his later years, Gödel believed that one of the primary culprits behind a vast conspiracy to suppress Leibniz's discoveries was none other than Bertrand Russell himself. During a conversation between Karl Menger and Gödel in 1933, science historian Hao Wang wrote, Menger asked Gödel, "Who could have an interest in destroying Leibniz's writings? Naturally, those people who do not want men to become more intelligent," Gödel replied. It is an unfortunate injustice that Russell never forgave Gödel for his crime of disproving his entropic cosmology and made certain that the remaining years of his life were hellish, with Gödel finally meeting a tragic end in 1977, convinced that Bertrand Russell and international secret societies were trying to destroy Leibniz and were also trying to poison him. Number 3, and the final one we're going to be looking at out of a long list of many, is Max Planck. At the end of his 1935 philosophy of physics, which extolled high praise on the directed evolution, harmony, and creative growth of the universe, the great Max Planck tackled the problem of entropy in an interesting manner. The second law of thermodynamics, the principle of the increase of entropy, has frequently been applied outside physics. For example, attempts have been made to apply the principle that all physical events develop in one sense only to biological evolution, a singularly unhappy attempt so long as the term evolution is associated with the idea of progress, perfection, or improvement. The principle of entropy is such that it can only deal with probabilities, and all that it really says is that a state, improbable in itself, is followed on an average by a more probable state. Biologically interpreted, this principle points towards degeneration rather than improvement. The chaotic, the ordinary, and the common is always more probable than the harmonious, the excellent, or the rare. Throughout his last decades of life, Planck worked tirelessly to break the false ideas that had arisen, because he understood these came about through 1. An absence of creativity, 2. A lack of love of actual truth, and 3. An obedience to materialism that prevented anyone from recognizing the higher plane of reality that only a creative spirit could understand. Planck stated, "As a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you, as a result of my research about atoms, this much. There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds the most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind." He also stated, "Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that is because, in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of nature, and therefore part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. Music and art are, to an extent, also attempts to solve, or at least express, that mystery. But to my mind, the more we progress with either, the more we are brought into harmony with all nature itself, and that is one of the great services of science to the individual." All these scientists recognized that their own personal creative thoughts, which leapt from states of ignorance to knowledge in non-mathematical leaps of eurekas, were 1. Driven by a love which no computer could express, 2. Reflected in the same loving, creative energy that shaped the unfolding of objective creation in ways that demonstrated the universe to not be a closed, dying, entropic system, but rather a system of living, creative, loving, yearning for infinite self-perfectibility. Conclusion. What we believe determines our ability to recognize and define true problems. What we believe determines what we see as solution. The Rishis, Rishi means great seer, were wise men of ancient days, who perceived and saw the universe and were scribes of the Vedas, where they wrote what they perceived. And now science states that perception and observation is crucial to foundations of what become a reality via the double-slit experiment. Like the Rishis of old, are these new thinkers and doers making predictions meant to guard society or to steer it? When we go through times of tribulation and people have no sense of belonging or hope and lose their connection to a collective such as a family or community, they can also lose their will to be expressive and creative, as there seems to be no purpose, and sooner or later, in short, the will to live. Are we at yet another point in human history where this is so? Have the negative thoughts and the negative focus on a disintegrating, dying universe led to us believing that there is no hope? Has it led to a deep feeling within the collective that our lives are meaningless, there is no hope, there is nothing to look forward to, there is no purpose, there is no meaning? So what's the point? What would our lives have been like? Or what would our lives be like on the collective level if we had life-affirming scientists to follow? What would our lives be like if we had followed the path of life-affirming science? Would our societies be right now at the brink of destruction? How would we view our lives? What new discoveries about the universe and our place in it would have been made? How would our societies and political systems have developed? Our current beliefs are the result of years of indoctrination that ancient Greek thought the classics were the only right thought, that they were a worthy and unquestionable foundation, the basis of gentlemanliness, the basis of manhood, and so the basis of all that good men do. The question for me on the rise of mediocrity that we're also seeing is that, are we being governed by mediocre thinkers who simply want to belong to a herd of what they believe to be forward-thinking men, rooted in what they believe to be an infallible basis of the past? By the fruit of the tree you will recognize them, and the grease out of which these thoughts we build upon arose is long, long, long gone. We need new, fresh, life-affirming thinkers for our day today.